Good morning, everyone. My name is Carrie Royer, and I work for the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority. Welcome to Duck Detectives. Today, since we can't all be together at the Water Festival, I thought I would at least sit next to water to get the feeling like we are at the Water Festival. The NPCA, or the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, owns and manages 41 conservation areas. You may have heard of Falls Falls or Binbrook or been to St. John's with your family. You may have also camped at Chippewa Creek or Long Beach conservation areas. My job at the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority is to be the coordinator of community outreach. So I work with schools, partners, and community groups to improve our watershed. If anybody has questions throughout the presentation today, I encourage you to send an email to waterfestival@niagararegion.ca and we'll do our best to answer any questions that you might have. Today, we're going to learn about ducks, migration, wetlands, and flyways. This plastic duck replica I have is one that you may commonly see around the neighborhood. I'll give you a second to try and guess what it is. If you guessed a mallard duck, you are correct. A mallard duck has a bright green head, a grayish light gray body, a dark brown breast, and darker tail. Like many birds, male and female mallards look different. So the male has all these beautiful bright colors, and like most birds, the females are slightly less colorful. So this is a female mallard. It is more drab brown colors modeling, but it has the same bright blue underneath its wing here. Mallard ducks are known as dabbling ducks because when they're feeding, they tip their bodies upwards so that you just see their tails sticking out of the water. And they feed on some of the vegetation and aquatic insects that live underwater. Very rarely do dabbling ducks dive underneath the water. Mallard ducks are not very particular about their habitat, so you often see them in backyard ponds, in parks, in ponds and parks, or anywhere that there's open water. Another duck that I have is a little bit more flashy. This is called a wood duck. A wood duck has a bright green head and lots of different colors. Almost every one of their feathers has a unique pattern. You can see the breast has this white sort of dotted detail on it. And they're very, very colorful and easily recognizable. They have a shorter neck compared to some other ducks. And a wood duck is named because of the habitat that it chooses to live. So a wood duck, as you can imagine, lives in the woods. They live in a special type of forest called a swamp forest. And this type of forest is known for staying wet for part of the year. The wood ducks make their nests in cavities left over in trees or holes in trees left by woodpeckers. When their babies are emerging, when they come out of the egg, after a few days, they need to get to water. So sometimes they have to jump from way up in the tree in order to get down to the water. Wood ducks have been known to lay their nests in trees as high as 50 feet or 15 meters off the ground. So imagine being a little baby duck having to jump all the way down that way. But they're so light that the fall doesn't hurt them and they are just able to carry on and go for a swim. The last duck replica that I have with me is called a northern pintail. And you can imagine that it gets its name from this long pointed tail that it has compared to the shorter tail of the mallard. A northern pintail has a long neck compared to that short neck of the wood duck. And it has this nice white stripe going down its chocolate brown head and neck. There are lots of different types of ducks in Niagara, and they can be seen in many spaces. The group of ducks are called waterfowl. Does anybody know what a waterfowl is? A waterfowl is a type of bird that lives on or near water most of its life. Does anybody know what waterfowl do in order to adapt to the cold winters that we have? They do something called migration. Migration is an animal adaptation where animals move from one area to the next from different times of the year. Sometimes it's for food, sometimes it's for breeding, and other times it's to get away from the cold. For today, we're going to focus on duck migration. In the spring and summer, ducks migrate north because there's lots of food, warmer weather, and good habitat. When the weather changes in the fall, they head south to get warm weather and good habitat down there. Some ducks travel really far distances to get as far away from the cold as possible. while some ducks, like our mallard friends, will go just slightly south so that they can get to anywhere where there's open water again. If you and your family are going on a long car trip, how would you get there? You would use a highway. Ducks use something called a flyway. So humans use highways, ducks use flyways. There are 4 major flyways in North America, and I'm going to share a map with you to show you the different flyways that we have. In Niagara, we are in the Atlantic Flyway, overlapped slightly by the Mississippi Flyway. Further west are the Central and Pacific Flyways. Many people think that birds only need a summer home and a winter home, but an important part of the migration route is the rest stops along the way. I bet when you're going on a long car trip, sometimes you need to stop for food, gas, or to use the bathroom. Birds need to do the same thing. As you can imagine, when you're a little duck, it takes a lot of energy to fly. You have to flap your wings and use up all that energy flying. And they don't have an engine like a plane. So along the way, they need to stop and rest and eat. What would you do if the places that you normally stopped at along the way were gone? This is why habitats are important. Imagine that a duck flew a really long distance and got to this area that it normally goes to, that's a wetland, and it got there and it was a parking lot instead. It wouldn't have anywhere to find food or shelter for the night, and it would have to try to find somewhere else to go. And they don't have maps. Ducks take the same flyway every year, so it's really important that we do our best to protect the flyways, the rest stops along their way. How do you think that scientists know where the ducks go? We certainly aren't flying along with them. Scientists use something called duck banding. Banding is one method that we use to know where the ducks are going when they're flying. In this image, you can see a duck's foot with a metal band around it. The metal band has a unique number that tells the scientists where the duck came from and what was the last location that it was picked up. These pliers are specially used to clamp the metal band around the duck's foot. It's just like a bracelet. It fits nice and loose on them and doesn't actually hurt the duck. In order to duck band, we can't just have anybody going around catching ducks and putting bands on them. You have to be specially trained in order to do it properly so that you're not hurting the duck, and you do it only at certain times of the year. As you can imagine, if you were to sneak up to a pond with a net to try to catch a duck, you probably wouldn't get very close before the duck would fly away. Birds are really tricky like that. So scientists have to wait till a special time of year. This is when the ducks are doing something called molting. As you can imagine, the feathers on a duck would get really worn out from all the flying that they do when they're migrating. So sometimes of the year, they lose those worn out feathers and they get new ones. This is usually happening while they're hatching their baby ducklings. So at this time, the scientists can track the ducks more easily because they can't fly. They trap them, they would measure how big they are, weigh them, identify what species of bird it is. Also, they would write down whether it was male or female, and then release it back to the wild unharmed. This has been going on for hundreds of years, and scientists have collected a lot of data or information about where ducks are going and where they are resting along the way. This allows us to make good choices about conservation, protection, and restoration of their habitats. One of the key habitats for waterfowl that migrate are wetlands. In Canada, 75% or 3 out of 4 wetlands have been destroyed, and because of this, the birds have had to find new habitats. Much of this destruction happened many, many years ago, before humans understood the value and importance of wetlands. Wetlands come in many sizes. Some are huge, covering hundreds of square kilometers, while others are smaller. Each have their own unique types of plant and wildlife that depend on them. In Niagara, we have 4 different types, in Ontario, we have 4 different types of wetlands: marshes, fens, bogs, and swamps. In Niagara, our most common wetland is called a swamp. And as we mentioned, it's the habitat of the wood duck. A swamp is a forested wetland. So it has tall trees and shrubs growing in it, and the forest floor is covered in water for part of the year. Forested swamps often dry up in the summertime, and you won't notice that they have water in them if you happen to visit a swamp in the summertime. The other most common type of wetland that we have in Niagara is called a marsh. A marsh is more of your traditional wetland that you think of when you think of a wetland. It's open water. My little pond here is sort of a small version of a marsh. It has open water, cattails, floating plants like water lilies, and it's great for those dabbling ducks like the mallards. Some organizations like conservation authorities and Ducks Unlimited are working together to increase wetland habitats for ducks and other wildlife through restoration and to conserve existing habitats. Wetlands are important not only for the ducks, but also they're important habitat and food for many animals. They also clean water because they're a natural filtration system. They control flooding, and all those trees and plants provide oxygen to the air that we all need to breathe. The next time you're out for a walk, see if you can find a wetland in your neighborhood, or maybe as you're driving along a road. Let's wrap up what we've learned today. Ducks, like my mallard friend, are a type of waterfowl. Waterfowl are a type of bird that lives on or near water most of the time. Some waterfowl migrate during different times of the year to get to their breeding habitat or to get to warmer weather. To get from one place to another, ducks use something called a flyway. There are 4 flyways in North America: the Pacific, the Central, the Mississippi, and the Atlantic. Some overlap each other, and our closest flyway is the Atlantic Flyway. Scientists use banding to find out more about the important habitats along the flyways so that we can make good choices about conservation, protection, and restoration. I'm going to take some questions from the audience, so please feel free to send them along. Once we are done today, I encourage you to get outside and see what kind of ducks and birds you can find in your neighborhood. Something you might like to take along with you is a pair of binoculars. As I mentioned, when you get close to ducks, they often fly away. So binoculars allows you to get a little bit of a closer view without getting too close. Another thing that's really great to bring along is a field guide. A field guide is a book that tells you about something. So this is a field guide about birds. If you don't have a field guide or a pair of binoculars, see if you can try and take a picture from far away or draw what you're seeing and then bring it home and see if you can identify it online. So I'm going to check out the chat and see what we have for questions. I have a question from Mrs. Reynolds' grade 4 class from the DSBN virtual school. Do ducks migrate all together like salmon, or do they migrate in smaller groups? That's an excellent question. They do migrate. Some of them migrate in groups. So you will often see those Canada geese flying in that V shape, and some of them migrate in smaller groups, but they don't migrate all together. They're usually in smaller groups. I have another question from Mrs. Ashen's class at Lakeview. How far do ducks fly during migration? So that depends on the species. So the mallard ducks will migrate a shorter distance. So they might only cover, say 100 kilometers or so to get to somewhere that's nearby that just has open water. So just a little bit further south from, the cold winters that we have here, where some will travel thousands of kilometers and get all the way down to South America. Another question, why is it that some birds can't fly? That is a good question. So some birds, like I guess we're talking about ostriches and things like that, it's mostly the way that their bodies are made. So their bodies may be too heavy to get off the ground. It has to do with the way that their bodies have been built and how they've evolved over time. So flight might have been something that's not as important to them. Like chickens and things like that are other examples of birds that have wings that they can't fly. If a duck's rest stop is gone, a wetland becomes a parking lot. Sorry, this is a question from John Brandt School, Mrs. Anderson's class at John Brandt School. If a duck's rest stop is gone and they have to go elsewhere to find a place to rest? Do they know how to get back on their flyway afterwards, or do they get lost? That's a really good question. I am fairly certain that they would be able to get back on their flyway. The flyways are really, really broad, and so they generally know their directions from north and south. So I don't think that they would get lost, but it just might disorient them a little bit, and they would have to kind of look around and see if they could find another wetland in the area, and then they would get back on the route. I think. I am no expert. Mrs. Reynolds, grade 4 class, what are we doing to protect wetlands in Niagara? In Niagara, wetlands are protected through special types of policies and legislation. There are provincially significant wetlands, and those are evaluated by the Ontario government. That once we know where the wetlands are, we can direct development away from the wetlands in order to protect them. So wetland destruction is something that does not happen as much today as it did hundreds of years ago. And then we also protect through land conservation. So the Conservation Authority owns habitats or lands that are specifically for wetland habitat. Mrs. Height's class, does climate change affect migration? Ooh, that's an excellent question. So climate change can have effect on migration. If it changes the habitat, it could affect where the birds are going, and it could change what the wetland looks like over time, depending on how severe the climate change is. It could also mean that some ducks are not migrating as far as they used to because they don't have to go as far to get away from the cold weather if it's getting warmer in their natural habitat. Some ducks or waterfowl like Canada geese have stopped flying. Some of them, if we're having a milder winter, they won't even leave. So it certainly does have an effect. And again, I am not the expert, but I would say that it certainly would have some type of effect on their migration. Mrs. Drasenko's class, how do ducks get food while flying? To my knowledge, they do not eat while they're flying. They wait until they get to those rest stops, and then they will get the food from the wetland or the habitat that they've stopped at. So it depends on if they're like a dabbling duck, they'll drink water and filter out those plants and bugs out of the water. But they definitely, I don't believe, are eating while they're flying. Mrs. Kovac's class, are any ducks populations that are in Niagara currently endangered? What can we do to help? In terms of a duck being endangered, I can't think of one off the top of my head. There likely is some, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. One thing that has really helped wood ducks is that people have started building nest boxes because they typically nest in the cavity of woodpecker holes in trees. People have attached wood duck nest boxes to trees, and the wood ducks have successfully used these to put their young in. We have wood duck boxes at some of our conservation areas, and we've seen them being used before. So one thing that humans can do is to protect the habitats that they know that the ducks are living in if they have them on their property, and sometimes building nest boxes or increasing the type of habitat that you have that you know they need is another way of helping. Mrs. Bagan's class, what are some wetlands where here in Niagara that we can visit? So the Conservation Authority has a lot of properties that are considered wetlands. St. John's Pond is a popular one that has a large pond. We also have the Willoughby Marsh, the Wainfleet Bog, and the Humberstone Marsh, which are all wetland habitats. Humberstone Marsh and Willoughby Marsh are actually swamps. So those are areas that can be visited. They don't have the greatest types of trail systems because they're so wet. We can't have maintained trails through them, but certainly people are welcome to visit them. The Wainfleet Wetlands is an abandoned quarry out in Wainfleet that actually has excellent habitat for ducks. So that's another great one to visit. Mrs. Downey's grade 3 or 4 class, should people feed ducks in the wild? That's an excellent question. We always recommend that people do not feed wild ducks. There's a few reasons for that. One reason is that people often feed ducks with stale bread, and the molds that are on the bread can actually be harmful to ducks if they ingest them. So we always encourage you to provide natural habitat, natural forage for birds, but to not actually go out and feed them. Mrs. Sirrett's class at William Hamilton Merit School. What do ducks eat? That's a good question. That depends on what kind of duck you're thinking of, but often they're eating little aquatic insects or bugs that live in the water, vegetation, so plants that are in the water, small fish, tadpoles, pretty much anything that is living in the water is something that a duck would eat, and just depends on the species. Some of them are more particular and others are not. Grade 3 class, how big can ducks get? Well, that's a really excellent question that I do not know the answer to. How big can they get? Trying to think of what is the biggest stuff that I can think of. I know a shoveler is a pretty big duck. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry, Mrs. Morris. I'm not sure what the big, I mean, I certainly know that like a swan is a big type of waterfowl. That's probably the biggest that we have around here. Mrs. Crawford's class, what age do baby ducks learn to fly? So I know that unlike songbirds, the baby ducks can jump out of the nest right away. So their mothers don't have to stay and feeding them from the nest. They get them out of the nest and they can swim within a few days usually. When they can fly, that question I don't know the answer to. I would assume because when they start out, they have that fluffy type of feathers, and then they are not feather. They have the the fluff until they get their feathers. So it wouldn't be until they have their full feathers that they would be able to fly. So I would say that that would probably take a couple of months. I do not see any more questions coming in. Oh, Mrs. Ross' class at Beacon School. What can we do to help protect ducks and wetlands? Learning about them is the #1 way that you can help protect ducks and wetlands. So learn about your local wetlands, learn about the ducks that live around here, what types of habitats do they need, and then visiting those areas and seeing what you can do to help them, maybe by cleaning up litter at your local park, making sure that there's no plastic and stuff floating around in the water. That's one really good way that you can help out. And then some people, individuals, people that own property are sometimes building wetlands on their property so that we can increase the amount of wetland habitat that we have in Niagara. So we work with local landowners in Niagara as a conservation authority to create habitat that will improve the amount of space that is here for ducks and other types of waterfowl and animals. No more time. All right, we're out of time. I thank you so much today for spending the morning with me and learning about ducks. Any questions that you had that I couldn't answer, I'm really sorry, but we'll do our best to answer them if you'd like to submit them at waterfestival@niagararegion.ca. I hope you all have a wonderful day and thanks so much. Take care.